Jong, Charlie Smith, Jong Benji, Georgia Strait. I'm Charlie Smith, editor of the Georgia Strait. I'm very happy to be back for another week on WOW TV. The biggest story across the country this week has been a Supreme Court of Canada ruling legalizing, or at least striking down, 3 prostitution laws. Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin wrote the ruling on behalf of the court. It was a unanimous decision. And the first law involves keeping a common body house, so it's basically brothels. There's been a prohibition against that in Canada for a long, long time, and the court ruled that this violates sex workers' security of the person because you're not allowed to have brothels. You haven't been in the past. That has meant that sex workers have had to work in isolation, and in the eyes of the court, this creates danger for them. So the next law that was struck down is communicating in public for the purpose of prostitution, and basically sex workers out in the streets selling their services. And that has been illegal as well for a long, long time. And the court ruled that that law is unconstitutional. And the third law is living off the avails of prostitution. And this is a law that was designed to target pimps so that you wouldn't have people who are controlling the prostitutes, profiting from the prostitutes, and abusing the prostitutes. But the people who are arguing against this in the court on behalf of sex workers groups said that it was too broad and it interfered with prostitutes' abilities to hire security guards or even to have assistants working with them in the course of their duties. So 3 laws have been struck down. Another law was not challenged, which is the prohibition against children involved in the sex trade. That is still illegal, as is human trafficking. The Chief Justice wrote in her ruling that the problem with these laws is they were too broad and actually contributed to the danger of sex work. Prostitution is actually legal in Canada. Most people don't know that the actual buying of selling and selling of sex is legal. What's illegal is doing it in public and doing it in a group, in a brothel, and it's also illegal to live off the proceeds of it. The 3 people who challenged the law were Ontario, 2 of them former sex workers, one is a sex worker. Terry Lynn Bedford was kind of the lead plaintiff in the case, and she made the argument that she wanted to go back into the sex trade. She wanted to be a dominatrix, but the laws made it impossible for her to do so because she couldn't hire security, she couldn't hire assistants, people would be living off the avails. In 2010, Ontario Court of Justice, Justice Susan Himmel ruled that in the Ontario Superior Court ruled that the 3 laws were unconstitutional. It went to the Ontario Court of Appeal, which ruled that one of the laws, the communicating in public, was constitutional in a 3-2 ruling, but that's been overturned by the Supreme Court of Canada. But it's not as if everything is legal today, because the court has given Parliament 1 year to respond. So Parliament can come up with legislation to deal with the sex trade, but it has to be in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice as outlined in the Supreme Court of Canada ruling. There's a Manitoba Conservative MP, Joy Smith, has come forward with a statement that the government should look at criminalizing the clients, the customers of sex workers. And this is the so-called Nordic model, and it's in place in Sweden. And by doing that, you would charge the customers, but not the sex workers. But a lawyer, Ellen Sigurdsson, who acted for the sex workers, says that charging the customers or bringing forward a law to do that would be inconsistent with the Supreme Court of Canada decision. So if the Conservative government goes down that road and decides to criminalize the customers of sex workers, I think we can expect more litigation. In the meantime, I've been speaking to Jamie Lee Hamilton, who's one of the longest kind of activists on behalf of striking down the laws. She was a sex worker in the West End of Vancouver in the 1970s, in the 80s, in the 90s. She remembers when Vancouver City Council would fine people $2,000 for practicing the sex trade in the West End. She now wants City Council to issue an apology and return the money. She says about $30,000 was collected over that period in 1981. In 1984, what the City of Vancouver did was they went to court, and the Attorney General, Brian Smith, of the day, and they got an injunction which prohibited sex workers from working in the streets kind of on the west side of Seymour Street. And that's what drove a lot of the sex workers into the downtown east side, into industrial areas. And in the view of Jamie Lee Hamilton, that is what made them more susceptible to predators such as Robert Pickton. So you had the prostitutes moved out of the West End in Vancouver into other areas, and then we had Canada's worst serial killer in Vancouver, operating in Vancouver, Robert William Pickton, and he was eventually charged with 26 murders. He was convicted of 6. The Crown didn't proceed on the other 20 charges. Robert Pickton was mentioned in the recent Supreme Court of Canada decision. What happened was Jamie Lee Hamilton set up a brothel, basically. It was called Grandma's House, and she was charged under the law of keeping a common body house several years ago. Eventually, the charge was stayed. She set this up to protect the sex workers, and now she's feeling very vindicated that the Supreme Court of Canada ruling has mentioned that brothel that she operated, Grandma's House, as an effort to make sex work safer for women in the business. And she also, Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin, mentioned that it was a response to predators such as Robert Pickton. We haven't heard the end of this story because I expect that the Conservative government will come forward with legislation, possibly targeted at the customers of sex workers, and then that will result in a whole bunch of legal challenges. In the meantime, this also presents challenges for police forces across the country, police boards, municipalities, because there's a one-year period when the federal government has to come back with its response. In the meantime, are the police going to be charging people involved in the sex trade? Are we going to see brothels being created in Vancouver and across the country? What's going to happen if sex workers decide they want to hire security personnel or assistants in their work? Will sex workers start returning to the streets in greater numbers? These are all open questions. One of the key people, and who's kind of gone under the radar screen in terms of the evolution of Canadian attitudes toward the sex trade, is an SFU criminology professor named John Lohman. And John Lohman has been studying the prostitution for decades, and his evidence was crucial in the Ontario Superior Court when Justice Susan Himmel brought forward her ruling striking down the 3 laws. So in many ways, this Supreme Court of Canada decision represents the life work of John Lohman, of Jamie Lee Hamilton, and what I found interesting is there's such a strong BC component to this decision. You had BC lawyers involved, like Katrina Pacey at the Pivot Legal Society. Joseph Arve was arguing it. You had Ellen Sigurdsson. You had lawyers on the other side, including Georgia Lee Lang, acting for the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. You had Beverly McLaughlin, who used to be the Chief Justice of the BC Supreme Court, so a former BC judge delivering the ruling. Plus you had researchers from Simon Fraser University, such as John Lohman, and sex workers like Jamie Lee Hamilton from Vancouver, who played a role in all of this. Some of the people who are on the winning side are feeling very emotional about the outcome, including Katrina Pacey and Jamie Lee Hamilton, because they feel they've won a major victory that's been going on for a long time. And one other story I'm going to deal with this week involves the Coalition of Progressive Electors. And this is the left-wing civic party at Vancouver City Hall. It used to have enormous power, but in recent years it's had less and less electoral success. Earlier this month, Alan Wong, who was their last remaining elected official, a school trustee, first elected in 1999. He crossed over and joined Vision Vancouver, which is Gregor Robertson's party. So now COPE is left with no elected officials. We recently had a story which highlighted why the party has such deep divisions and why many members are abandoning COPE. And it's partly because two organizations, left-wing organizations, have become affiliated with Tim Lewis, who's the former city councillor and park board commissioner. Tim Lewis is a lawyer, former chairman of Ann City, and he's the internal chair of COPE. Well, he's been relying on a group called Fire This Time and Mobilization Against War and Occupation. These are extreme left-wing groups to stack meetings and to vote with him against other members of the party. And that was true in the case of proportional representation in terms of how COPE would deal with this policy. So as a result, others in the party have been abandoning the party or complaining publicly, including Stuart Parker, former leader of the BC Green Party. So there's problems within COPE. It remains to be seen whether they'll get their house in order in time for the 2014 election. This is good news for Gregor Robertson and Vision Vancouver because it leaves them a better opportunity to soak up votes on the progressive side. And meanwhile, the NPA seems to be getting stronger. They've got some money. George Affleck and Elizabeth Ball are their only two councillors right now. But as we look toward the 2014 election, it's increasingly looking like a battle between Vision Vancouver and the NPA.